Welcome to the Sleep with History channel, where true historical tales slowly unfold to soothe your mind and help you rest. Have you ever stood before a sculpture and felt like it was about to breathe? Like the marble veins had blood flowing through them. That incredible, lifelike quality wasn't just an accident. It was the obsession of a revolutionary era, the Renaissance. We're journeying back in time from the 14th to the 17th century to understand how artists went from stiff, symbolic figures to creating some of the most breathtaking depictions of the human body ever seen. And now, before your mind drifts deeper into this peaceful journey, take just a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. Because every night, with true stories from the Renaissance, you'll fall asleep calmer, deeper, and more at peace. This isn't just an art history lesson. It's the story of how humanity rediscovered itself in stone and bronze. Before the Renaissance, art, especially in Europe, was dominated by the medieval style. Think of the sculptures on old cathedrals. They are often elongated, rigid, and more symbolic than realistic. Their purpose was to tell a religious story, to represent an idea of a saint or a king, not to show them as they actually were. The human body was often seen as something sinful, a vessel of worldly temptation, so it was hidden under layers of drapery, its true form ignored. The focus was on the soul, on the divine, not on the flesh. But then, something began to change. The spark that ignited the Renaissance was a rediscovery of the past. Scholars and artists began unearthing the long-forgotten art and literature of ancient Greece and Rome. And what did they find? They found sculptures that celebrated the human form. The Greeks and Romans saw beauty, strength, and perfection in the body. They studied anatomy, proportion, and how muscles moved. For the emerging Renaissance artists, seeing a classical sculpture like the Laocoon group with its writhing figures full of agony and muscle was like a lightning bolt. It was a revelation. They realized that art could be both deeply human and profoundly beautiful. This newfound inspiration led to a radical shift. Artists were no longer content just to copy old styles. They wanted to understand. They became scientists in their own right. Imagine this. Leonardo da Vinci, a name we all know, wasn't just painting the Mona Lisa. He was secretly dissecting human corpses, something forbidden and dangerous at the time, all to learn exactly how the muscles connected to the bone, how a smile formed, how a hand gestured. He filled notebooks with thousands of detailed anatomical drawings. He wasn't alone. Artists across Italy and beyond were obsessed with getting it right. They studied living models, drawing them from every conceivable angle, capturing the subtle shift of weight in a pose, the tension in a flexed arm, the gentle curve of a spine. This intense study gave birth to a key concept of Renaissance sculpture. Contrapposto. It sounds fancy, but you do it every day. Stand up straight. Now, put most of your weight on one leg. See how your hips and shoulders tilt in opposite directions. That's contrapposto. It's a natural, relaxed human stance. Before the Renaissance, figures stood stiffly, like soldiers at attention. But artists like Donatello brought contrapposto back. Look at his bronze statue of David. He's not rigid. He's relaxed, confident, with his weight shifted onto one leg. This simple twist makes the figure feel alive, dynamic, and psychologically present. It's not just a statue, it's a character. And who is the undisputed master of this new approach? Michelangelo. His David is arguably the most famous sculpture in the world, And for good reason. It's a colossal figure, over 17 feet tall, carved from a single block of flawed marble that other artists had abandoned. But it's the anatomical perfection that's truly mind-blowing. David isn't depicted after his victory, but in the moment before the fight with Goliath, you can see the tension in his neck as he looks toward his foe. His brow is furrowed in concentration. The veins bulge on the back of his hand. His muscles are taut, ready for action. Michelangelo combined his deep knowledge of anatomy with an incredible ability to convey emotion, or terribilità, as the Italians called itanosum, powerful grandeur. He wasn't just carving marble. He was carving humanity with all its strength, vulnerability, and determination. Michelangelo's other works, like his Pietà, show a different side of this anatomical mastery. Here, a youthful Mary holds the body of the crucified Christ. The anatomy is still perfect, but it's used to evoke deep pathos and sorrow. You feel the lifeless weight of Christ's body draped across his mother's lap, the way his arm hangs down, the gentle way her hand supports emits a masterclass in conveying emotion through the physical form. The folds of Mary's robe are incredibly detailed, but they don't hide the bodies beneath. They accentuate them, creating a flow and a rhythm that guides your eye and your heart. As the Renaissance progressed, this focus on realism and dynamism evolved. Artists in the later period, known as the Mannerists and early Baroque, took the foundations laid by Donatello and Michelangelo and pushed them to the extreme. Look at Giambologna's Rape of the Sabine Women. It's not a single, stable figure. It's a spiraling vortex of three bodies, twisting and turning in a complex, interlocking composition. The sculpture has no single viewpoint. You have to walk around it to understand the drama unfolding. This style, called figura serpentinata, or the serpentine figure, creates a sense of frantic energy and movement. The artists were so confident in their anatomical skills that they could now manipulate the body into these incredibly complex and emotionally charged poses, breaking free from the calm, balanced harmony of the High Renaissance. So, why does all this matter? The Renaissance's obsession with the human body in sculpture was more than just an artistic trend. It was part of a larger philosophical movement called humanism. Humanism placed a new emphasis on human potential, on individual achievement, and on our experience here on Earth. By sculpting the human body with such realism, dignity, and beauty, Renaissance artists were making a powerful statement. They were saying that humans are remarkable, that our bodies are not something to be ashamed of, but something to be celebrated. They were bridging the gap between the divine and the mortal, showing that you could find God's perfection in the masterpiece of the human form. This legacy is still with us. Every time you see a lifelike statue in a park, every time a comic book artist perfectly draws a hero in action, every time a CGI character moves realistically on screen, you are seeing the echoes of the Renaissance. The artists of that era taught us how to see ourselves, and their work continues to remind us of the beauty, complexity, and incredible potential of the human form. They didn't just carve stone, they carved a new way of seeing humanity itself. We're embarking on a journey back in time to one of the most transformative periods in human history, the Renaissance. This was an era of incredible rebirth, not just in art and science, but in the very way people saw the world and their place within it. And nowhere is this more evident than in the stunning architecture that emerged between the 14th and 17th century. We're going to explore how Renaissance architects looked back to the classical worlds of ancient Greece and Rome to rediscover a lost secret, the key to creating perfect harmony, balance, and beauty the secret wasn't just about building bigger or taller. It was about building better using the timeless principles of mathematics and geometry specifically. We'll be diving deep into the concept of the golden proportion or the golden ratio. So, what exactly is the golden ratio? You might have heard of it as a divine number, approximately 1.618 for centuries. It has been seen as the blueprint for beauty found everywhere in nature, from the spiral of a seashell to the arrangement of petals on a flower. The ancient Greeks were masters at using it in their architecture, most famously in the Parthenon in Athens. They believed this ratio created structures that were inherently pleasing to the human eye. After the fall of the Roman Empire, much of this classical knowledge was lost or set aside during the Middle Ages. Gothic architecture, with its soaring spires, pointed arches, and flying buttresses, was all about reaching towards the heavens. It was dramatic, awe-inspiring, and focused on divinity. While beautiful in its own right, its design philosophy was fundamentally different. The emphasis was on verticality and light, not necessarily on human-centric proportion and symmetry. Then came the Renaissance, a period sparked by a renewed interest in humanism. Thinkers and artists started to place humanity back at the center of the universe. They believed that humans, created in God's image, were capable of reason, creativity, and achieving perfection. This new worldview demanded a new style of architecture, one that reflected order, clarity, and rational thought. And so, architects turned back the pages of history to the classical masters. One of the pioneers who lit this torch was Filippo Brunelleschi. If you've ever been to Florence, you've seen his masterpiece, the magnificent dome of the Florence Cathedral. But his genius wasn't just in engineering that incredible structure. In his other works, like the Pazzi Chapel or the Basilica of San Lorenzo, you can see a deliberate return to classical forms. He used round arches instead of pointed ones, Corinthian columns, and simple geometric shapes like squares and circles. Look closely at the façade of the Pazzi Chapel. You can almost feel the mathematical precision. The space is organized into a clear, logical grid. The height and width of the central arch, the placement of the windows, the proportions of the columns, it all feels harmonious and balanced. Brunelleschi was essentially creating a visual language based on the principles of proportion that the ancients had cherished. He was bringing classical rationality back into a world that had been dominated by Gothic spiritualism for centuries. Following in Brunelleschi's footsteps was another giant of the Renaissance. Alberti was more than just an architect. He was a true Renaissance manna writer, a theorist, and an artist. He wrote a groundbreaking treatise called On the Art of Building, where he explicitly laid out the rules for creating perfect architecture. He argued that beauty was the harmony of all parts in relation to one another. This harmony was achieved through precise mathematical reasoning. He studied the works of Vitruvius, an ancient Roman architect, and expanded upon his ideas. Alberti designed buildings like the Palazzo Ruscilla in Florence and the Basilica of Sant'Andrea in Mantua. If you look at the Palazzo Ruscilla, you'll see a façade that is a masterclass in order and proportion. It's divided into 3 tiers, each with its own classical order of columns, just like the Colosseum in Rome. The spacing of the windows and the horizontal bands that separate the floors create a sense of rhythm and stability. It doesn't soar dramatically. It sits confidently, a testament to human reason and classical elegance. The Basilica of Sant'Andrea is another perfect example. Its massive central arch on the façade mirrors the triumphal arches of ancient Rome. The interior is designed with a massive barrel vault, also a Roman feature. The entire plan is based on a system of interlocking squares and proportional relationships. When you walk inside, you don't feel overwhelmed. You feel a sense of grandeur and serene, logical order. This was the goal: to create spaces that were not only beautiful, but also intellectually satisfying. This fascination with golden proportions and classical ideals continued throughout the High Renaissance, with architects like the Tempietto in Rome is a small circular temple that is considered a perfect gem of High Renaissance architecture. It's almost like a sculpture. Its circular design, the perfect spacing of the Doric columns. The dome is a pure expression of classical harmony. It perfectly embodies the Renaissance ideal of a centrally planned building, which was considered the most perfect geometric form, reflecting the perfection of God and the universe. And of course, we can't talk about Renaissance architecture without mentioning Andrea Palladio. Working a bit later in the 16th century, Palladio took these ideas and perfected them, creating a style so influential that it's now known as Palladian. He designed numerous villas in the Venetian countryside, like the famous Villa Capra, also known as La Rotonda. The Villa Rotonda is the ultimate example of Renaissance symmetry and proportion. It's a perfectly square building with 4 identical porticos, one on each side, each resembling a classical temple front. The entire design is governed by strict mathematical ratios. The result is a building that is in complete harmony with itself and with the surrounding landscape. Palladio's 4 books of architecture became a design Bible for architects for centuries to come, spreading these Renaissance ideas all across Europe and even to America. So, why was this return to golden proportions so important? It represented a fundamental shift in thinking. Instead of seeing architecture as simply a way to shelter people or glorify God, Renaissance architects saw it as a science and an art form that could reflect the inherent order of the cosmos. They believed that by using these timeless, universal principles of geometry and proportion, they could create buildings that were not just functional, but were truly, objectively beautiful. This wasn't just an aesthetic choice. It was a philosophical one. It was a declaration that humanity, through reason and intellect, could understand the secrets of the universe and replicate its divine harmony here on earth. The buildings of the Renaissance are a testament to this powerful idea, perfect fusion of art, mathematics, and philosophy. They stand today as enduring symbols of a time when the world was rediscovered and humanity's potential seemed limitless. Have you ever stood beneath a massive dome, like the one on St. Peter's Basilica or the Florence Cathedral, and just wondered, how on earth did they build this? We are talking centuries ago, without the cranes, computers, and advanced materials we have today. It seems almost impossible, right? Well, today, we re-pulling back the curtain on one of the greatest architectural and engineering revolutions in human history, the construction of the Renaissance dome. This isn't just a story about bricks and mortar. It's a tale of genius, rivalry, and the daring spirit that defined an era. Before the Renaissance, the Romans were the undisputed masters of the dome. Think of the Pantheon in Rome with its massive, unreinforced concrete dome and the iconic oculus opening to the sky. It was a marvel of ancient engineering. After the fall of Rome, however, much of that knowledge was lost. For nearly 1,000 years, building a dome on that scale was simply beyond the capabilities of medieval builders. They could construct beautiful cathedrals with soaring vaults, but a wide, self-supporting dome, that was a puzzle nobody could solve. The secrets of Roman concrete had vanished, and the mathematical principles required were forgotten. The challenge lay dormant, waiting for a new age of thinkers to reawaken the ambition of the ancients. That new age was the Renaissance, a period of explosive creativity and intellectual rebirth that swept across Europe, starting in Italy from the 14th to the 17th century. There was a renewed fascination with the classical world of Greece and Rome. Artists and scholars rediscovered ancient texts on philosophy, science, and, crucially, architecture. They began to look at the world not just through the lens of faith, but through the lens of human reason, observation, and mathematics. This shift in thinking was the secret ingredient. It gave architects the confidence to dream bigger and the tools to turn those dreams into reality. They weren't just copying the Romans, they were aiming to surpass them. And the ultimate test of this new ambition came in Florence, Italy. For over a century, the city's grand new cathedral, Santa Maria do Fiore, stood unfinished. It had a gigantic hole in its roof, an octagonal opening over 140 feet across, wider than any dome ever built. The original planners had no idea how to cover it. The space was too wide for traditional wooden centering, the scaffolding used to support the dome during construction. The walls couldn't support the immense weight and outward push or hoop stress of a conventional hemispherical dome. For decades, it was the city's greatest source of both pride and embarrassment. Then, in 1418, the city announced a competition to solve this unsolvable problem. Intec Filippo Brunelleschi. He was a goldsmith and clockmaker, not a formally trained architect, which made him a controversial choice. But Brunelleschi was a true Renaissance man, brilliant, secretive, and sometimes difficult genius. He had spent years in Rome, studying ancient ruins, meticulously measuring the Pantheon, and trying to reverse engineer its secrets. He returned to Florence with a plan so audacious, so revolutionary, that he initially refused to even explain it fully to the judges, fearing his rivals would steal his ideas. Brunelleschi's proposal was pure genius. Instead of one massive, heavy dome, he proposed building two. An inner, thicker shell would provide the primary structure, while a lighter, taller outer shell would protect it from the elements and create the magnificent silhouette we see today. This double shell design significantly reduced the overall weight. But how would he hold it up during construction without any scaffolding from the ground? This was his masterstroke. He designed a herringbone brick pattern, a spina di pes, where bricks were laid in a way that they interlocked and supported themselves as the dome spiraled upwards. This meant the dome was essentially self-supporting, course by course. Furthermore, to counteract the outward thrust that would cause the dome to crack and collapse, Brunelleschi integrated a series of massive horizontal chains made of sandstone and iron and Ivan wood at different levels within the walls of the dome itself, acting like invisible hoops holding everything together. He also had to invent the machines to make it all happen. He designed a revolutionary ox-powered hoist with a reversing gear, allowing a single team of oxen to lift heavy sandstone beams and other materials hundreds of feet into the air without having to unhitch and turn around. It was a complete systema fusion of brilliant structural design and groundbreaking mechanical engineering. Brunelleschi's success in Florence ignited a dome fever across Italy and the rest of Europe. His work proved that with the right application of mathematics and mechanics, architects could achieve things previously thought impossible. The next great chapter in this story unfolds in Rome, with the Dome of St. Peter's initially designed by Bramante and then radically reimagined by Michelangelo. This dome took the lessons from Florence and pushed them even further. Michelangelo, though in his 70s when he took over the project, admired Brunelleschi's work. He also opted for a double shell design, but made his dome steeper and more pointed, which is not only aesthetically striking, but also structurally more stable, as it directs the weight more downwards than outwards. Michelangelo, however, died before his dome was completed. It was his successor, Gioachino della Porta, who saw it through, making some final modifications. He implemented a series of iron chains for reinforcement, learning from Brunelleschi's principles to contain the immense forces at play. When you stand in St. Peter's Square and look up at that iconic dome, you're seeing the culmination of over a century of Renaissance innovation, a direct descendant of the engineering breakthroughs that happened in Florence. These architects weren't just builders, they were scientists. They conducted experiments, calculated forces, and invented new technologies. The influence of these Italian domes spread far and wide. In London, after the Great Fire of 1666, Sir Christopher Wren was tasked with rebuilding the city's churches, including its centerpiece, St. Paul's Cathedral. Wren, a brilliant astronomer and mathematician, traveled to Paris and studied drawings of the great domes of Italy. For St. Paul's, he designed a complex and ingenious triple dome structure. There's the shallow inner dome that visitors see from inside, a hidden, unadorned brick cone that provides the primary structural support for the heavy stone lantern on top, and the grand, lead-covered outer dome that defines London's skyline. This three-part solution was Wren's unique answer to the same problems of weight and thrust that Brunelleschi and Michelangelo had faced. So, the next time you see a grand dome, whether it's on a state capitol building, a cathedral, or in a historic photograph, remember the Renaissance revolution that made it possible? It was a time when art and science merged, when ancient wisdom was rediscovered and then surpassed by daring innovation. The geniuses of the Renaissance didn't just build domes. They taught us how to reach for the heavens with stone and reason, creating legacies that continue to inspire awe and wonder centuries later. We're taking a journey back in time, stepping into the magnificent cities of Florence and Rome during one of the most transformative periods in human history, the Renaissance, from the 14th to the 17th century. These Italian cities became the epicenters of a cultural rebirth that would forever change the world of art, science, and, of course, architecture. Imagine walking through the streets of 14th century Florence. The air is buzzing with new ideas, a renewed interest in the classical worlds of ancient Greece and Rome. This isn't just a nostalgic look back, it's a revolutionary reinterpretation. Architects are moving away from the soaring, pointed arches of the Gothic style and embracing a new language of design, one based on symmetry, proportion, and harmony. It's a style that speaks of humanism, placing human experience and reason at the very center of the universe. So, what was the spark that ignited this architectural revolution? It began in Florence, a wealthy city-state powered by trade and banking. Powerful families, like the Medici, became incredible patrons of the arts. They weren't just funding buildings, they were funding a vision. They wanted their city to be a testament to their power, their intellect, and their sophisticated taste. And the architect who arguably lit to the fuse was Filippo Brunelleschi. Before Brunelleschi, no one had figured out how to place a massive dome on Florence's cathedral, the Santa Maria del Fiore. It was an engineering puzzle that had stumped the best minds for decades. Brunelleschi, a goldsmith and sculptor by training, traveled to Rome, studied the ancient Pantheon, and returned with a brilliant, innovative plan. He designed a double-shelled dome, using a herringbone brick pattern and a system of internal chains to counteract the immense pressure. When it was completed in 1436, it was more than just a roof. It was a symbol of Florentine ingenuity and the dawn of a new age. It dominated the skyline, a declaration that humanity could achieve the seemingly impossible. Brunelleschi didn't stop there. Take a look at the Pazzi Chapel or the Basilica of San Lorenzo. You'll see his signature style: clean lines, graceful arches, and a mathematical precision that creates a sense of serene, balanced space. He used classical elements like Corinthian columns and rounded arches, not as mere copies, but as a vocabulary to create something entirely new. The feeling you get inside one of his buildings is one of order, clarity, and intellectual beauty. It's an architecture designed for the human scale, meant to inspire contemplation and awe, not fear. Following in Brunelleschi's footsteps was Leon Battista Alberti, who was as much a scholar as he was an architect. Alberti wrote on the art of building a foundational text that codified the principles of Renaissance architecture. He argued that a building should be a harmonious whole, where every part relates to every other part, just like in nature. His work on the façade of Santa Maria Novella in Florence is a perfect example. He brilliantly blended the existing Gothic structure with classical forms, using elegant scrolls to connect the upper and lower levels, creating a unified and stunningly beautiful composition. These architects weren't just building structures, they were crafting urban environments. They designed public squares or piazzas that acted as open-air living rooms for the city. Think Piazza della Signoria in Florengi. It's surrounded by powerful civic buildings and beautiful sculptures. It was a stage for public life, for festivals, for political discourse. The architecture itself helps to define the space, making it an organized, inviting, and impressive civic art. These piazzas became the models for urban planning across Europe. Now, let's shift our journey south to Rome. By the late 5th, 10th, and early 16th centuries, the center of the Renaissance had moved. Rome, the seat of the papacy, was ready for its own grand transformation. The popes, particularly figures like Julius II and Leo X, were ambitious patrons. They wanted to restore Rome to its former glory, to make it the undisputed capital of the Christian world. And they had the resources to do it on an unimaginable scale. The project that defines the High Renaissance in Rome is, without a doubt, the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica. The original ancient basilica was crumbling, and Pope Julius II envisioned a replacement that would be the grandest church on earth. The project would span over a century and involved the greatest artistic minds of the era. The first chief architect was Donato Bramante. His initial design was for a perfectly symmetrical Greek cross plan topped by a huge central dome inspired by the Pantheon. Bramante's vision was one of classical perfection and monumental scale. After Bramante, a succession of architects, including Raphael, took over the project. But the one who left the most indelible mark on St. Peter's was the legendary Michelangelo, taking over in his 70s. Michelangelo returned to the power of a central dome but redesigned it with a more dynamic, muscular, and soaring profile, though he didn't live to see it completed. His design for the dome of St. Peter's became an iconic symbol of Rome and of the Catholic Church itself. It's a masterpiece of engineering and art, a structure that seems to rise towards the heavens with breathtaking power. Beyond St. Peter's, Michelangelo's architectural genius is on full display at the Capitoline Hill. He was tasked with redesigning this chaotic medieval plaza. What he did was pure genius. He created a beautiful trapezoidal piazza to create a sense of forced perspective, making the space feel larger and more grand. He designed new facades for the existing buildings and added a third, creating a harmonious and enclosed space. At the center he placed an ancient Roman statue of Emperor Marcus Aurelius. It was a brilliant piece of urban theater, linking the power of the papal city directly to the glory of ancient Rome. The influence of Rome's high Renaissance spread throughout the city. Palaces for cardinals and noble families, known as palazzi, sprang up. These weren't just homes. They were urban fortresses that expressed wealth and power. Take the Palazzo Farnese, for instance. Its massive, imposing facade speaks of stability and authority, while its internal courtyard is a refined, elegant space reflecting the classical ideals of Bramante and his followers. The architecture of the Renaissance in Florence and Rome was more than just a style. It was a physical manifestation of a profound shift in human consciousness. It celebrated order, reason, and human potential. From Brunelleschi's dome, a triumph of ingenuity, to Michelangelo's St. Peter's, a monument of faith and power, these buildings tell a story. They tell the story of ambitious patrons, brilliant artists, and cities vying to become the greatest in the world. They created a visual language that would influence architecture for centuries to come, and their legacy continues to inspire and awe us to this very day. Have you ever walked past a grand old building with stately columns and felt a sense of awe? Chances are you are looking at a piece of architecture inspired by a revolutionary period in history, the Renaissance. We're going on a journey back in time, from the 14th to the 17th century, to rediscover how ancient designs were reborn and changed the world forever. Let us talk about the Renaissance and its love affair with two specific styles of columns, the Doric and the Corinthian. So, what exactly was the Renaissance? The word itself means rebirth, and that's the perfect description. After the Middle Ages, scholars and artists in Europe, especially in Italy, began looking back to the classical worlds of ancient Greece and Rome. They were fascinated by their art, philosophy, and, of course, their incredible architecture. They didn't just want to copy it. They wanted to understand its principles, harmony, proportion, and symmetry, and use them to create something new, something that reflected their own optimistic, human-centric worldview. At the heart of this architectural revival were the classical orders, which are essentially styles of columns and the structures above them. Think of them as a complete design system. The ancient Greeks had three main orders: Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. The Romans adopted these and added two of their own, the Tuscan and the Composite. During the Renaissance, architects became obsessed with these orders. They studied ancient ruins and read the works of the Roman architect who had written a detailed guide called On Architecture. For Renaissance builders, using the correct order wasn't just a design choice. It was a way to connect with the greatness of the past and bring its virtues into their own time. Let's start with the Doric order. If the classical orders were a family, Doric would be the strong, silent father figure. It's the oldest and simplest of the Greek orders. A Doric column is sturdy and powerful. It has a plain, unadorned capital that's the top part of the column. It often has no base, meaning it sits directly on the floor, or the shaft of the column is fluted with sharp ridges. The overall impression is one of strength, stability, and masculine virtue. In ancient Greece, the Doric order was used for major temples dedicated to male gods, like the Parthenon in Athens, which is a prime example of its grandeur. When Renaissance architects rediscovered the Doric order, they saw in it the perfect expression of solemnity and strength. They didn't just copy it, they adapted it. For instance, the Roman version of the Doric which Renaissance architects often drew from, typically included a simple base, giving it a slightly more refined look. They believed that different orders had different characters. According to theorists like Sebastiano Serlio, the Doric was appropriate for buildings dedicated to powerful male saints, like St. Peter, or for military structures, fortresses, and city gates, where its robust appearance symbolized security and power. A fantastic example of this is the courtyard of the Palazzo Pitti in Florence, designed by Bartolomeo. The ground floor features massive, rusticated stonework combined with powerful Doric columns. The effect is formidable, projecting the power and authority of the Medici family who lived there. It says, "This is a place of strength and importance." Another example is Donato Bramante's Tempietto in Rome. This small circular shrine is considered a masterpiece of high Renaissance architecture. Bramante chose the Doric order for its solemnity and gravity, believing it was the right fit for a site marking the martyrdom of Saint Peter. The Tempietto isn't big, but its perfect proportions and the use of the Doric order give it immense dignity. Now, let's move to the other end of the spectrum, the Corinthian order. If Doric is the strong father, Corinthian is the elegant, beautiful maiden. It's the most ornate and slender of the three Greek orders. What makes it instantly recognizable is its magnificent capital. It's decorated with sculpted acanthus leaves and small scrolls, creating a look of incredible richness and sophistication. The shaft is tall and slender, and its fluting is delicate. The overall feeling is one of luxury, grace, and beauty. The Romans absolutely loved the Corinthian order and used it for their most important public buildings, like the Pantheon in Rome, to showcase the wealth and power of their empire. Naturally, Renaissance architects were completely captivated by the Corinthian order's elegance. They saw it as the pinnacle of classical beauty. It was considered the most beautiful of all the orders, suitable for buildings dedicated to the Virgin Mary, to virgin saints, or for palaces and public buildings that needed to express magnificence and refinement. The intricate, Natare-inspired capital also resonated with the Renaissance interest in the natural world. Carving a perfect Corinthian capital was a test of a stonemason's skill, a true mark of craftsmanship. You can see the Corinthian order used to breathtaking effect all across Renaissance Italy. One of the most famous examples is the exterior of St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City. Michelangelo, in his final design for the basilica, used giant Corinthian pilasters, which are like flattened columns attached to the wall. These colossal pilasters rise up the full height of the building, unifying the massive facade and giving it a sense of soaring, divine grandeur. They lift your eyes toward the sky, toward the magnificent dome, creating an experience that is both monumental and deeply spiritual. Another stunning example is Filippo Brunelleschi's Pazzi Chapelle in Florence. This is a jewel of early Renaissance architecture. Inside, you see graceful gray stone Corinthian pilasters set against white plaster walls. The effect isn't overwhelming or opulent. It's serene, harmonious, and intellectually beautiful. Brunelleschi used the Corinthian order to create a space that feels both sacred and human-scaled. A perfect reflection of Renaissance ideals. The geometry is precise, the lines are clean, and the delicate Corinthian capitals add a touch of refined beauty that completes the perfect composition. So, what's the big takeaway here? The use of Doric and Corinthian columns during the Renaissance wasn't just about decoration. It was a language. Architects used these ancient forms to tell stories and convey ideas. The choice between the robust, masculine Doric and the elegant, feminine Corinthian was a deliberate one, loaded with meaning. A Doric column could communicate strength, order, and solemnity. A Corinthian column could express beauty, wealth, and divine grace. This revival of classical architecture was more than just an artistic trend. It was part of a profound cultural shift. By building in the style of the ancients, Renaissance society was linking itself to a golden age of knowledge, power, and beauty. They were making a bold statement about their own era, presenting it as a worthy successor to the glories of Greece and Rome. These buildings, with their perfectly proportioned columns, were symbols of a new age of confidence, humanism, and incredible creativity. Next time you see a building with columns, take a closer look. Is it simple and strong, like the Doric, or is it ornate and graceful, like the Corinthian? You might just be looking at a legacy of the Renaissance, a silent story told in stone, connecting our modern world to the brilliant rebirth of classical ideas that took place over 500 years ago. The principles of harmony, proportion, and beauty that they championed are timeless, and they continue to influence how we build and how we see the world around us. Relationship between religion and beauty in church design. We're embarking on a journey back in time to an era of profound change, artistic explosion, and spiritual awakening. The Renaissance. Specifically, we're going to explore a fascinating and beautiful relationship, the one between religion and beauty, as told through the magnificent churches built between the 14th and 17th centuries. Have you ever walked into a grand cathedral and just stopped completely in awe? The soaring ceilings, the light streaming through stained glass, the intricate carvings, ... It's an experience that transcends mere architecture. During the Renaissance, this was entirely the point. These weren't just buildings. They were sermons in stone and glass, designed to inspire devotion and give people a tangible glimpse of the divine. To really understand this, we need to rewind a bit to the medieval mindset that came before. Gothic cathedrals, with their immense height and pointed arches, were all about reaching towards heaven. They emphasized God's power and otherworldly nature. But as the Renaissance dawned, a new philosophy began to take hold. Humanism. This wasn't about abandoning faith. Far from it. It was about celebrating human potential and intellect as God-given gifts. Thinkers and artists started looking back to the classical worlds of ancient Greece and Rome, rediscovering their principles of harmony, proportion, and balance. And this is where things get really interesting. Architects began to fuse these classical ideas with Christian theology. They believed that beauty wasn't just decoration. It was an attribute of God Himself. If God created a perfectly ordered universe, then shouldn't the house of God on earth reflect that same perfect order? Suddenly, mathematics became a form of worship. The circle, symbolizing eternity and God's perfection, and the square, representing the stable earthly world, became foundational elements in church design. Let us talk about one of the most iconic examples. Filippo Brunelleschi, Dome for the Florence Cathedral. For over a century, the cathedral sat with a giant hole in its roof because no one knew how to build a dome that vast. Brunelleschi, a genius goldsmith and clockmaker turned architect, studied ancient Roman structures like the Pantheon. He devised a revolutionary double-shelled design and a unique herringbone brick pattern that allowed the dome to support itself as it was built. When it was finished, it wasn't just an engineering marvel. It was a symbol of human ingenuity serving divine glory. It dominated the Florence skyline, a constant reminder to the citizens of God's presence and the city's devotion. Standing beneath it, you feel an incredible sense of uplift and harmony. A space that feels both monumental and human. That was the goal, to create a space where the divine and the human could meet. This philosophy of divine proportion extended to every detail. Architects like Leon Battista Alberti wrote extensively on the subject. He argued that beauty was the reasoned harmony of all the parts within a body. So, a church's layout, the height of its columns, the width of its aisles, the placement of its windows, everything was calculated according to precise mathematical ratios. This created a sense of visual calm and intellectual clarity, guiding the worshipper's mind away from the chaos of the outside world and toward contemplation and prayer. The very logic and order of the building were meant to be a reflection of divine logic. Now, let's step inside one of these churches. What do you see? Light. Lots of it. Unlike the often darker interiors of Gothic churches, Renaissance architects wanted to flood their spaces with clear, bright light. This wasn't just for practical reasons. Light was a powerful theological symbol. In the Gospel of John, Christ is called the light of the world. So, a brightly lit church symbolized the light of divine truth and wisdom, illuminating the faithful. Large, clear glass windows replaced the intricate stained glass of the Gothic era, allowing unobstructed sunlight to pour in, creating a space that felt open, rational, and filled with grace. St. Peter's Basilica in Rome is a perfect example of this. When you walk inside, the sheer volume of light coming from Michelangelo's magnificent dome is breathtaking. It feels like heaven itself is opening up above you. And of course, we can't talk about Renaissance churches without talking about the art that filled them. This was the age of masters like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael. For them, art was not just illustration. It was a form of theological exploration. Patrons, including the Pope himself, commissioned these artists to create altarpieces and sculptures that would bring biblical stories to life with unprecedented realism and emotional depth. Take Michelangelo's work in the Sistine Chapel. On the ceiling, he painted the story of creation with figures that were powerful, dynamic, and incredibly human. This was a radical departure. He wasn't just showing God as an abstract force. He was depicting the divine in a form that people could relate to. Then, years later, he returned to paint the Last Judgment on the altar wall. It's a terrifying and awe-inspiring vision of salvation and damnation, designed to make every person who saw it confront their own mortality and the consequences of their actions. The beauty and drama of the art were meant to stir the soul, to make faith a deeply personal and emotional experience. The art wasn't separate from the architecture. It was an integral part of the church's mission to teach, to inspire, and to move the hearts of the faithful. Even the materials used were chosen for their beauty and symbolism. Polished marble, gleaming gold, and rich woods weren't seen as extravagant luxuries. They were offerings, the very best of the material world being given back to its creator. The beauty of the materials was meant to honor God and give worshippers a sensory taste of the richness of the heavenly kingdom. It was a holistic experience where every element, from the grand architectural plan down to the smallest carved detail, worked together to create a powerful spiritual message. So, when we look at a Renaissance church, we're seeing more than just an old building. We are looking at a profound statement about the relationship between humanity, beauty, and the divine. These architects and artists believed that by creating perfectly harmonious and beautiful spaces, they were not only honoring God, but also helping people to better understand their place in His creation. They built churches that were both monuments to God as glory and celebrations of the human ability to create, reason, and perceive beauty. It was a unique moment in history when art, science, and faith came together to create some of the most enduring and inspiring structures ever made. Next time you have the chance to visit a Renaissance church, take a moment, look for the symmetry. Notice how the light fills the space, and let the art tell you its story. You will all be connecting with a centuries-old conversation about the nature of God and our search for beauty and meaning. Design of public spaces in Renaissance cities were taking a stroll through history, back to the bustling streets and grand squares of Renaissance Europe. Have you ever wondered why so many old European city centers feel so perfectly designed, almost like an outdoor living room? Well, you can thank the brilliant minds of the Renaissance. This wasn't just an era of breathtaking art and scientific discovery. It was a time when the very idea of the city was reinvented. Before the Renaissance, many medieval cities were a maze of narrow, winding streets, built primarily for defense. But as the 14th century dawned, a new way of thinking emerged, particularly in Italy, inspired by the rediscovered ideals of ancient Greece and Rome. Thinkers, artists, and architects began to envision cities not just as fortresses, but as expressions of order, beauty, and civic pride. They believed that a well-designed city could elevate the human spirit. And the heart of this new vision was the public space, the piazza, the square, the courtyard. So what exactly changed? The key was a shift towards rational design. Architects started using principles like symmetry, proportion, and perspective, which were being perfected in painting. They weren't just placing buildings next to each other anymore. They were choreographing an experience. The goal was to create harmonious, unified spaces that were both functional and awe-inspiring. They wanted you to stand in the middle of a square and feel a sense of balance and wonder. Let's talk about the star of the show, the Italian piazza. This was more than just an open area. It was the civic and social nucleus of the city. Think of the Piazza della Signoria in Florence. It's not an accident that it feels so grand. It's a carefully staged space framed by powerful buildings like the Palazzo di Laggia dei Lanzi with its soaring arches acts like an open-air gallery, seamlessly blending architecture with public life. The piazza was designed to be a theater for human activity, for markets, for festivals, for political announcements, and for simple, everyday social interactions. One of the masterminds behind this revolution was Leon Battista Alberti. In his influential treatise on the art of building, he laid out clear guidelines for urban design. He argued that public squares should be beautiful, surrounded by impressive buildings with porticos and colonnades to provide shelter and create a sense of enclosure. He even specified that the size of the square should be proportional to the surrounding city, ensuring it felt neither overwhelmingly large nor claustrophobically small. It was all about achieving that perfect, human-scaled harmony. Now, let's journey to Rome to see these ideas on a truly monumental scale. When Michelangelo was commissioned to redesign the Capitoline Hill, or Campidoglio, he inherited a chaotic, irregular space. What he created is one of the most brilliant examples of Renaissance urban planning. He didn't try to force a simple rectangular shape onto the awkward site. Instead, he designed a stunning trapezoidal piazza, which creates a subtle, forced perspective, making the main palace at the end seem more imposing and grand. He unified the facades of the surrounding buildings and, in the center, placed the magnificent equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius. The entire space is a masterpiece of dynamic tension and visual harmony, guiding your eye and your movement. The intricate oval pattern on the ground isn't just decoration. It pulls the entire composition together, drawing you towards the center. It's a space that makes you feel like a participant in a grand historical drama. But it wasn't just about the big, famous squares. The principles of Renaissance design trickled down into every aspect of the city. Streets were widened and straightened to create clear sight lines, often terminating in an important landmark like a church or an obelisk. This created what we call a visual axis, a powerful tool for organizing urban space and emphasizing civic and religious centers. The Strada Nuova Novaya Garibaldi in Genoa is a fantastic example. It was a whole street designed for the city's wealthiest families, with a succession of magnificent palaces creating a unified, luxurious corridor. This new approach also considered the connection between buildings and the spaces around them. The courtyard became a central feature of Renaissance palaces, or palazzi. Unlike the fortified, inward-looking medieval castle, the Renaissance palazzo opened up. The central courtyard, often surrounded by elegant arcades, was a semi-private space that brought light and air into the building and served as a graceful transition from the public street to the private residence. It was a symbol of a new, more open and confident society. Of course, these grand designs served a purpose beyond just aesthetics. They were powerful statements of authority and wealth. A powerful family like the Medici in Florence or a pope in Rome used architecture and urban planning to project their influence and legitimize their rule by creating beautiful, orderly, and functional public spaces. They were demonstrating their capacity to govern effectively. The city itself became a canvas for showcasing power, piety, and prestige. As the Renaissance spread from Italy across Europe, these ideas were adapted to different local contexts. In France, we see the Place des Vosges. In Paris, a beautifully uniform residential square that perfectly embodies the Renaissance ideals of order and harmony. In Spain, the Plaza Mayor in cities like Madrid and Salamanca became the quintessential Spanish square, a grand, enclosed rectangle used for everything from royal ceremonies to books. Each culture put its own spin on the concept, but the core principles of symmetry, proportion, and the creation of a unified, stage-like public space remained. So, the next time you find yourself in a historic European city, take a moment to really look at the main square. Notice how the buildings frame the space. See if you can spot the visual axes, the symmetrical facades, the arcades, and you're not just standing in an empty space. You're standing inside a carefully composed work of art, a legacy of the Renaissance visionaries who believed that a beautiful city could create a better life for its citizens. They taught us that the spaces between buildings are just as important as the buildings themselves, a lesson that urban planners and architects are still learning from today. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel. Today, we're embarking on a journey back in time to an era of unparalleled artistic and intellectual awakening, the Italian Renaissance. But we're not just looking at paintings or sculptures. We're stepping into the magnificent world of the Italian villa, the ultimate symbol of wealth, power, and sophisticated taste during the 14th to 17th centuries. So, what exactly was a Renaissance villa? It was far more than just a big house in the country. It was a statement in a time when a new, powerful merchant class was rising, particularly in cities like Florence, Venice, and Rome. These families needed a way to display their newfound status. They couldn't just build a bigger palace in the already crowded city. The real prestige lay in owning land, in creating a personal paradise outside the city walls. this was a concept inherited from the ancient Romans, like Pliny the Younger, whose letters described his own luxurious country estates. The Renaissance humanists, obsessed with classical antiquity, revived this idea, and their wealthy patrons had the money to make it a reality. The villa was a retreat, a place for otium, a Latin term for leisure dedicated to intellectual pursuits. It was a place to escape the heat, the plagues, and the political turmoil of the city. Here, the owner could read philosophy, write poetry, entertain scholars and artists, and contemplate nature. But make no mistake, this was a very public form of private life. Every detail of the villa was designed to impress. Let's start with the location. The ideal villa was situated on a hillside offering a commanding view of the surrounding landscape, which often included the owner's agricultural lands, a visible reminder of their economic power. This elevated position wasn't just for the view, it was strategic. It provided cool breezes in the summer and symbolized the owner's elevated social standing, looking down upon their domain. The journey to the villa itself was part of the experience, a gradual ascent from the common world into a carefully orchestrated realm of beauty. Now, let's talk architecture. Architects like Andrea Palladio became superstars of their time, and his designs are the epitome of Renaissance ideals. Palladio's villas, like the famous Villa Capra, also known as La Rotonda, are masterpieces of mathematical harmony, symmetry, and proportion. He believed that architecture should reflect the perfect order of the universe. The facades were often inspired by ancient Roman temples, with grand porticos, columns, and pediments. This wasn't just copying the past. It was a way for these new money families to link themselves to the glory and authority of the Roman Empire, legitimizing their own power. Stepping inside, you'd be greeted by a symphony of art and luxury. The interiors were just as important as the exteriors. Frescoed ceilings and walls depicted scenes from classical mythology, history, or allegorical tales that celebrated the virtues and achievements of the owner's family. Artists like Veronese and the Carracci brothers transformed entire rooms into immersive works of art. The message was clear. The owner was not just wealthy, but also cultured, educated, and a patron of the finest talents of the age. The choice of mythological subjects, like Apollo or Venus, subtly associated the family with the gods themselves. But the villa's story doesn't end at its walls. The gardens were perhaps the most spectacular feature of all. These were not just patches of green. They were outdoor rooms, extensions of the villa's architectural logic. Italian Renaissance gardens were formal and geometric, organized around a central axis that often aligned with the main entrance of the house. Hedges were clipped into perfect shapes, a practice known as topiary, demonstrating man's control over nature. Water was a key element, a symbol of life and luxury, especially in the hot Italian summers. Elaborate fountains, grottos, and water channels filled the garden with movement and sound. At places like Favilla, destined Tivoli, hundreds of fountains create a breathtaking spectacle, powered by ingenious hydraulic engineering. This wasn't just for show. It was a display of technical mastery and immense wealth. To be able to channel that much water for purely aesthetic pleasure was the ultimate status symbol. These gardens were also designed for strolling and contemplation. Hidden pathways would lead to secret grottos, classical statues, and quiet seating areas. Each turn revealed a new, carefully composed view. It was like walking through a living painting. The garden was a theater for the senses, filled with the scent of citrus and roses, the sound of trickling water, and the sight of perfect man-made beauty. Beyond the formal garden, The villa was the center of a productive agricultural estate, this practical side was crucial. The estate produced wine, olive oil, grain, and other goods that not only supplied the owner's household, but were also sold for profit. This blend of pleasure and productivity, otium and negotium business, was a core ideal. The villa owner was a gentleman farmer, a sophisticated urbanite who was also grounded in the land, the ultimate source of true wealth. The beautiful villa was supported by the working farm, a perfect marriage of aesthetics and economics. So, when we look at a Renaissance villa, we're seeing more than just a beautiful building. We're seeing a complex symbol. It represents the owner's wealth demonstrated by the scale of the project and the materials used. It showcases their culture and intellect through the classical architecture and literary themes in the art. It asserts their power through the commanding views and the control over the landscape. And it embodies a new ideal of life, one that balances leisure with productivity and city with country. These villas were the physical manifestation of the Renaissance dream. They were places where art, nature, and philosophy came together, all paid for by the burgeoning wealth of a new era. They were stages upon which the wealthy elite could perform their status for all to see, from the harmonious proportions of Palladio to the theatrical waterworks of the Villa d'Este. The Italian villa remains one of the most powerful and enduring symbols of status and taste in Western history. Renaissance architecture in England, Inigo Jones. We're journeying back in time to 17th century England, a period of dramatic change, not just in politics and society, but also in the very buildings that shaped the London skyline. For centuries, England was the land of Gothic spires and Tudor timber frames. Think of the intricate, soaring cathedrals or the cozy, familiar look of Shakespeare's globe. This was the architectural language everyone knew. But across the Channel, in Italy, a revolution had been underway for nearly 2 centuries. The Renaissance, a rebirth of classical Greek and Roman ideals. Beauty was found in symmetry, proportion, and elegant simplicity for a long time. England seemed content in its Gothic comfort zone. But one man was about to change all of that. His name was Inigo Jones. And he didn't just introduce Renaissance architecture to England. He ignited a revolution in stone and mortar. So, who was this trailblazer? Inigo Jones wasn't born into aristocracy or a family of master builders. He was the son of a cloth worker, born in London in 1573. His early life is a bit of a mystery, but what we know for sure is that he had an incredible artistic talent and an insatiable curiosity. His big break came when he traveled to Italy. Imagine a young man from Tudor London, accustomed to jagged roofs and ornate carvings, suddenly standing before the Pantheon in Rome or seeing the works of the great Italian architect Andrea Palladio. It must have been a revelation. Jones didn't just sightsee. He studied. He sketched ancient ruins, he measured columns, and he absorbed the mathematical principles of classical design. Palladio's work, in particular with its clean lines, logical layouts, and use of classical elements like columns and pediments, left a profound mark on him. He returned to England not as a tourist, but as a visionary, armed with a completely new architectural vocabulary. Back in England, Jones found a receptive audience in the royal court of King James I and later Charles I. The court was eager to project an image of sophistication, power, and modernity, and the old Gothic style just didn't cut it anymore. They wanted palaces that looked like the grand villas of Italy, not medieval castles. This was Jones's moment to shine, one of his first major royal commissions, and perhaps his most revolutionary was the Queen's House in Greenwich, designed for Anne of Denmark. Construction began in 1616. Today, it might look elegant and understated, but back then, it was a bombshell. It was the first purely classical building in the entire country. Imagine your neighbor's reactions if you suddenly built a gleaming, white, perfectly symmetrical cube in a neighborhood of quaint, crooked cottages. That was the impact of the Queen's house. It had no Gothic fuss, no Tudor timber. It was a study in perfect proportions, with a clean façade, symmetrical windows on the central loggia. It was rational, it was calm, and it was utterly, completely new. It was a statement that England was no longer a cultural backwater, but a modern European power. But Inigo Jones's masterpiece, the building that truly cemented his legacy, is the Banqueting House at Whitehall in London. The original Tudor Hall had burned down, and in 1619, Jones was commissioned to build its replacement. What he created is one of the most important buildings in English architectural history, standing on the busy Whitehall Street today. It still stops you in your tracks. It's a perfect, harmonious rectangle. Jones used a clever trick with the stonework, making the ground floor look strong and rustic, while the upper floors appear more refined and elegant. He alternated triangular and curved pediments above the windows, a signature classical move he learned from his Italian studies. The whole design is governed by a strict mathematical harmony. It was a complete rejection of the English tradition and a wholehearted embrace of Palladian classicism. This building wasn't just a party hall. It was a piece of political propaganda, a symbol of the Stuart monarchy's belief in order, divine right, and absolute power, all expressed through the universal language of classical architecture. Step inside the banqueting house, and you'll find that the interior is just as revolutionary as the exterior. It's one single, breathtaking, spasa, double cube room, meaning its length is twice its width and height. This creates a feeling of perfect, harmonious proportion that is almost overwhelming. But the real showstopper is the ceiling. Jones collaborated with the famous Flemish painter Peter Paul Rubens, who created a magnificent set of 9 canvases celebrating the reign of King James I. This fusion of architecture and painting, where both arts work together to create a single, unified, and awe-inspiring effect, was another concept imported directly from the Italian Renaissance. The entire experience was designed to overwhelm the senses and impress upon visitors the majesty and divine authority of the king. It was a total work of art, and nothing like it had ever been seen in England before. It set the standard for state apartments and royal interiors for the next century. Jones's influence wasn't limited to royal palaces. He was also involved in the first real example of urban planning in London, Covent Garden. Before Jones, London was a chaotic medieval maze of narrow, winding streets. The Earl of Bedford owned a large patch of land and hired Jones to develop it into a fashionable residential square or piazza, inspired by those he'd seen in Italy. He designed elegant, unified terraces of houses with classical facades, all facing a large, open square. In the center, he placed a church, St. Paul's, when the Earl, conscious of his budget, asked for a simple barn of a church. Jones famously replied that he would build him the handsomest barn in Europe, and he did. The Church of St. Paul's at Covent Garden is a masterpiece of masculine simplicity, with a grand Tuscan portico that looks like it was lifted directly from an ancient Roman temple. It demonstrated that the classical language wasn't just for palaces. It could be adapted to create dignified and harmonious urban spaces for people to live in. So, what is the ultimate legacy of Inigo Jones? He was more than just an architect. He was a cultural importer, an educator, and a revolutionary. He single-handedly dragged English architecture out of its medieval past and into the modern classical world. His work, based on the principles of symmetry, harmony, and proportion, introduced a new standard of elegance and sophistication. This style, known as Palladionism, would dominate British architecture for the next 200 years, shaping everything from country houses to public buildings. Architects like Christopher Wren, who rebuilt London after the Great Fire, were his direct intellectual heirs. Every time you see a grand Georgian townhouse with its symmetrical windows, or a stately home with a classical portico and columns, you are seeing the long shadow cast by Inigo Jones. He didn't just design buildings, he taught England a whole new way to think about beauty, order, and its place in the world. He was truly England's first great classical architect. Have you ever wondered why a grand villa in Florence looks so different from a chateau in the French countryside, even though they were both built during the Renaissance? It's not just about different architects having different ideas. The real secrets are hidden in the climate and the culture of the time. Let's dive into how the sun, the rain, and the very soul of a society shaped the incredible buildings of the Renaissance. The Renaissance, spanning from the 14th to the 17th century, was a rebirth of classical ideas from ancient Greece and Rome. It all started in Florence, Italy, a place blessed with a warm, sunny, Mediterranean climate. Think about it. Lots of sunshine, mild winters. What does that mean for architecture? It means you can have large windows to let in natural light without worrying too much about losing heat. It means you can have open-air courtyards, or corteles, which became the heart of Italian Renaissance palaces, like the one in the Palazzo Medici. These courtyards weren't just for show. They were natural air conditioning systems, creating cool, shaded spaces for families to gather, away from the midday sun. Loggias, those beautiful covered galleries with one open side, are another classic Italian feature. They provided shade and a place to enjoy a breeze, seamlessly blending the indoors with the outdoors. Italian architects used light-colored materials like marble and limestone, not just because they were available, but because they reflected sunlight and helped keep the buildings cool. The whole design philosophy was about openness, light, and harmony with the pleasant climate. The focus was on creating elegant, comfortable spaces that embraced the beautiful Italian weather. But what happened when the Renaissance traveled north? As these new ideas spread to countries like France, England, and Germany, they had to adapt. The weather in Northern Europe is a whole different story, isn't it? It's colder, wetter, and there's a lot less sunshine, especially in winter. You can't just copy and paste an Italian villa design into the French Loire Valley and expect it to work. Architects had to get clever. So, what did they do? First, those large, airy windows from Italy became a bit of a problem. They would let out too much precious heat. The solution was to make windows smaller, or to use more of them in clusters to capture as much light as possible without creating a draft. Glass was expensive, so large panes were a status symbol, but the overall window-to-wall ratio was often smaller than in Italy. And those open courtyards, they were often enclosed or completely abandoned in favor of more compact, heat-retaining layouts. Instead of flat or low-pitched roofs, designed for sunny weather, Northern European Renaissance buildings featured steeply pitched roofs. This was a purely practical decision. The steep angle helped heavy rain and snow slide off easily, preventing leaks and structural damage. You can see this clearly in buildings like the Château de Chambord in France, with its forest of ornate chimneys and steep roofs. And speaking of chimneys, they became much more prominent and numerous. In Italy, a central fireplace might be enough, but in the colder north, multiple fireplaces were essential for heating the vast rooms of castles and manors. These chimneys weren't just functional. They became highly decorative architectural elements, signaling the wealth and comfort of the owner. The choice of building materials also shifted dramatically. While Italians used light-colored stone, northern builders often turned to local materials like timber, brick, and darker stone. Half-timbered construction, with its exposed wooden framework, is a classic feature of the Northern Renaissance, especially in England and Germany. These materials were readily available and provided good insulation against the cold. The overall look became heavier, more robust, and more enclosed compared to the light, open feel of Italian architecture. It was a Renaissance style, yes, but one that was wearing a warm coat. Now, let's talk about culture, because architecture isn't just about staying warm or cool. It's a reflection of who we are and what we value. In Renaissance Italy, the cultural landscape was dominated by wealthy merchant families and powerful cities. Families like the Medici in Florence used architecture to project their power, wealth, and refined taste. Their city palaces, or palazzi, were built to impress. The ground floor was often fortified and used for business, showing their commercial power. The upper floors, the piano nobile, were for lavish living and entertaining, filled with art and luxurious furnishings, showcasing their cultural sophistication. The design of these Italian palaces, with their symmetrical facades and classical details like columns and pediments, was a deliberate statement. It connected these new merchant princes to the glory of ancient Rome, legitimizing their social status. Humanism, the intellectual movement at the heart of the Renaissance, celebrated human potential and rational thought. This is perfectly mirrored in the architecture. Clear, logical, and based on mathematical principles of proportion and harmony. The buildings were designed for human comfort and enjoyment, a significant shift from the divine focus of the earlier Gothic period. When we move north, the cultural context changes. In France, for example, the monarchy and the old nobility held much of the power. The Renaissance style was adopted not by merchants, but by the king and his court. French châteaux like Chambord or Fontainebleau were not city palaces for business. They were sprawling country estates built for leisure, hunting, and displaying royal magnificence. They combined Italian classical elements like symmetry and ornamentation with traditional French castle features like towers and moats. It was a fusion of the new, fashionable style with deep-rooted symbols of feudal power. In England, the Renaissance arrived later, during the Tudor and Elizabethan eras. It was a time of growing national pride and prosperity. Wealthy landowners built grand country houses, known as prodigy houses, like Hardwick Hall. A famous saying at the time was Hardwick Hall, more glass than wall. This shows how having large windows, which were expensive and a sign of new technology, became a massive status symbol. It was a way of showing off your immense wealth and being on the cutting edge of fashion. The culture was one of conspicuous consumption, and the houses were built to be seen and admired, often with a focus on showcasing vast collections of portraits and tapestries inside. So you see, a Renaissance building is like a storybook written in stone and timber. The climate tells you about the practical challenges the builders faced, the sun they welcomed or the snow they shed. The culture tells you about the people who built it, their ambitions, their values, and how they saw their place in the world. Whether it is a sun-drenched Italian palazzo celebrating rational humanism, or a English manor house displaying newfound wealth, the architecture of the Renaissance is a beautiful and complex tapestry woven from the threads of environment and society. The next time you see a historic building, take a closer look. You might be surprised by the stories it has to tell about the weather it has endured and the culture it represents. Thank you so much for joining me on this architectural journey through the Renaissance. If you enjoyed this and want to explore more stories hidden in history and art, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us create more content for you. See you in the next video. And now, let the fire take you into a world of calm and dreams.